and then we'll just kind of quickly go through this. Since it's a small group, just feel free to kind of chime in if you have any questions at all. And just to get some context, Doug, like what's your experience with Ionic and Vue, so I kind of know the pace I want to move along here?
Yeah, I've been working with it for about 5 years, maybe a little more.
Working with Ionic or working with Vue?
Ionic. I'm brand new to Vue.
So Ionic Angular or Ionic? Have you dabbled with React at all in Ionic?
No Ionic React and some Ionic Angular since JS.
Hmm. Okay, all right. Since I think most of you guys know me already, I'm just going to kind of hop. Well, actually, this is being recorded, so I will try to cover the basics. So this is the Washington D.C. Ionic Meetup group. I try to have them when I think there's something interesting to share. I'm always open to people sending in suggestions on topics for me to chat about. So feel free to email me directly or through the Meetup. Just shoot and say, hey, I think this would be an interesting topic. If anyone's interested in presenting a topic, also ping me, and I'm more than happy to kind of schedule it and promote it, and just to kind of get the word out. Since everybody's kind of moved online, I've been aggressively just promoting the meetup basically anywhere. So since it's virtual, there's no need necessarily for it to be restricted to people who live in the DC region. So share with your friends. Okay, so once again, this is my experience. I have over 30 years of experience in software development. I've been using Ionic since 2014, so I've been using it for quite a bit. Kind of like what Doug said, I started out with the first version using AngularJS, and moved on to the next version that came after that with Angular. As soon as React became available, started dabbling with that. As soon as Vue became available, I started dabbling with Vue. When the Vue thing started to slide, I just abandoned most of the Vue work that I did, and we went all in with React. I'm now going back through the process of updating. I have a bunch of projects in my GitHub repo that were written on the older version, and I'm in the process of going back through and updating them all. So my goal, hopefully, is to get all those projects updated. Some of them, for those who follow me on YouTube, also some of them I've converted to YouTube videos to kind of walk through the source code also. And then eventually, probably if I get some break time around Thanksgiving or Christmas, I'm going to kind of put together a course with a series of videos and source code that will be offered, and then I'll wrap that also with an in-person, kind of like the premium package, which will be course materials, in-person lecture, and videos, everything all packaged up for folks who kind of want more of a hands-on approach to kind of integrating Ionic with Vue. And then I'm going to take the exact same content and go through it all with React and Ionic too. So my goal is to get 2 courses out. I doubt I'll get it done by the end of the year, so I'm going to say hopefully by first quarter 2021. A bunch of the stuff I've done is also related to the courses that I've taught through Inclusive Innovation Incubator. We have a program called the Futures Written in Code, which we were funded by the mayor's office to teach technology training courses. So we offered Ionic training for free. We taught an Ionic Angular, we taught an Ionic Vue, we taught an Ionic React. We also taught a Unity game development course, and we taught a Python course. COVID hit the budget pretty hard, so we're in the process of trying to raise more money to hopefully run some more courses. We were hoping to get some out fourth quarter, but it looks like they might get pushed to first quarter 2021. So getting started with Ionic and Vue, I spent a lot of time in the forums, and a lot of questions that people ask, the answers are available if you just use a CLI and build a template application. So I strongly recommend that when you first kind of dig into this, that you use the CLI and create template applications. There's a tab template, there is a list template, there is a side menu template, and then there's like a super, I think the conference app has been upgraded, but a lot of the basic questions about routing, tabs, that stuff is all available by just creating a sample application and kind of looking there in the source code. Also, another thing which I saw in a forums recently was someone was they're not happy because they haven't they haven't bought into TypeScript yet. And so they're like, why is all this stuff in TypeScript? I don't want to use TypeScript. What can I do? The template applications that are generated in TypeScript because Vue is pushing TypeScript. But you can go in and just kind of rename things and get it to work. I put it on my list as like a quick video tutorial that I'm probably going to post to my YouTube channel on basically how to convert one of the sample apps to just work without TypeScript, so that it doesn't inhibit people from kind of using Ionic framework and Vue, because I think it's a great combination. Uh, I I'm an old school programmer, so I started back in the day with Java. So when I first got to JavaScript, it was kind of weird that they didn't have types, and I was like, "What the hell is this? You can just throw whatever you want together, and it just works. There's no type checking." So, transitioning back to TypeScript was a little bit of a challenge, but after you get used to it, you see the benefits of it. I still have struggles internally with my team to get my team bought in. They complain about it, but I'm like, look, guys, it's going to save you time in the end. Oh, I left the old React slide in here. All right, so this is what I'm going to try and do today. I think people want to see code, so basically what I've done, I've built a sample application. I've uploaded the sample application to the chat for anyone who wants to kind of download it, and I'm going to kind of walk through the features in the application. I tried to cover topics that I see people asking questions about very often when they use this. And like I said, since it's a small group, feel free to interrupt at any time and ask me a question, so I can make sure so I can explain it to you. That's one of the reasons I gave you the code in advance. So if you want to, you can kind of make notes in the code as I'm going through and explaining it. But so this is what we're going to do. We're going to cover tabs. I know that the tabs is a default template that they provide, but they actually don't show you how to use a detail page in a default template, which is one of the biggest questions that I see people ask all the time is like, hey, this is great, but how do I get a detail page? Um, the loading indicator issue in the early release, anything that did like a pop-up or an alert or loading, none of those worked. That was resolved in the last 0.5.0 release, so I've integrated an example of how to do that. And I'm doing it the way that you see in React, where they just treat it as just another component in a template that you can hide and show, versus the old way, which is you import a controller and you use the controller to create it, and then the controller adds it to the DOM. I think you're going to see more of the kind of embed the template in the page and hide and show it approach. So that's what I went with. Of course, you have to show how to create a list view with objects. Another issue that always pops up is state management. People are asked, hey, how come when I do something in one tab and I go to the other tab, I don't see it changing? Do I need to reload the data? I mean, the short answer to all this is like, you need to use some sort of state management library or some sort of state management function or some sort of reactive objects. But you know, I think that things have changed quite a bit. For those who've used React, using React hooks has made it a lot simpler to kind of manage state very easily without the complexity of Redux. Um, Vue has this idea of, I've been calling them hooks because they look and function exactly like hooks in React. But I saw someone say the other day they're called composables. So that will be the new word that I will use. It's the composition API with composables. And so what I've done in this example, excuse me, I've shown how you can use a composable to manage state across two tabs. And also it also keeps track of your authentication state. And so when you update your authentication state inside of this composable, any page that is referenced to it will get the updated state. If you add objects to, in this example, I have a list of objects. If I add objects to that list in one tab, when I go to the other tab, it is automatically updated because it's referencing the exact same reactive variable. And so like this is to me like a fundamental concept that I think is critical for folks to understand. um, Very often I see people just completely reloading a database every time they go to a page. Like they're making an API call to the backend every single time. And it's just, Yeah, it works, but it's really not scalable, and you're going to run into issues later if you ever really try to take that solution to production. Um, and then the
And
last thing I'll try to cover is just how easy it is to integrate capacitors so that you can get your applications running on a mobile device, which I think is one of the most compelling things about what the direction that Ionic is going. As someone who spent a lot of time mucking around with Cordova, like all the way back to the phone gap days. I mean, I had to use phone gap for some client projects back in the day, and that was just like heart wrenching, you know. So I think capacitor is pretty awesome. All right. So this is my leftover slide from my React demo, which is what not what we're about. And then now we're going to hop into some source code. Let me try to switch and find my source code. Now I gotta bring this new window to the front. And I think I'm gonna have to share my whole desktop in this scenario. Okay. Hold on, someone needed to join. All right, I just got him in. Let's see. Yep. Okay. All right, let me switch to my new window to share.
before you begin, may I ask you a quick question about the course that you're setting up?
Yeah, go ahead.
Um, will it include how to put components into your app?
What do you mean by components? Plugins or components?
Because I'm not familiar with Vue or React. With Angular, especially Angular JS, there was if I wanted a widget, then that would
Yep.
okay.
Yes, it will cover that. So basically, create your own custom components that can be embedded.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, I've gotten much more aggressive with using components since once your apps start getting really big, and if you really want to start to separate, you use this concept of separation of concerns and kind of keep your logic at the top level and just embed a bunch of components inside of your page. You'll really get into components. I have a video posted on my YouTube channel about using another tool called Storybook, which allows you to build your components independent of the rest of your application. And basically, you just mock all the data that goes into them. So it allows you to not kind of get bogged down with the overhead of worrying about how everything else fits together, and you can just focus solely on your specific component. Okay, so let's hop into the code. So I'm going to start right from the main TS. This is a slightly modified version of, let me, hold on, let me get the final app up so you can see what we're going for in the build. Okay. So over in the side here is what we are striving for. Well, actually what I built and what I'm walking through. And so the idea here is that um, we have a basic application that shows you how to log in. Um, it captures some information from the authentication state, which is the email address. We have two tabs. We show how to go from a top level tab into a detail page. And then we show how I can modify my state by saying enter here. You can see it adds it to an object that's in my state, and then when I go back to my other page, it reactively gets the content that has been added here. So this is what we're going to walk through, and for the people who just hopped on, I think the zip file that has all the source code was uploaded to the chat, so you should be able to download the chat and get the source code. If I end up making any modifications to this as I walk through it, I will upload it again at the end. It's quite possible that there's something that I got wrong the first time, and so I always leave that open when I go through source code. Okay, so we'll start at main TS. When you generate your application using the Ionic commands to initialize your application, which is all provided here in this Ionic Quick Start, which walks you through. That's why I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. It walks you through how to use a CLI and get your basic application up and running. You install the latest version of the CLI to make sure you get the updated view components, and then you can just create an application based on the type. I'll paste this in the chat also. But like I said, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going through that because the documentation's already there. And there's the link for that.
When you
So it
say
just creates.
oh, sorry about that.
No, go ahead.
When you say the updated Vue components, you're talking about the Ionic components that work with Vue?
Yes.
Okay.
Because it's still in beta and they're making fixes. The easiest, if you have the latest CLI, when you run this command here below, you can see this website, right?
I can.
When you run this command here below and you specify type and you say to type tag view beta, it will make sure that in the package JSON, it has the latest versions of the Vue components included in your project.
Got it.
All right. Okay. And this is all based on the latest version of Vue 3, which was just recently released. So here's how you create your basic Ionic app. There's nothing special here. The important thing to notice is that it has all of the CSS and everything that you need to make your app render properly. So you get that out of the box. And then if we go from the main, it creates the app component. So then let's go into our app component. And here's where you start to see some of the Ionic that you know and love for those who, let me make this a little bigger. That might have been too big, but we'll see. For those who are familiar with it. A couple of things to notice here is this use of defined component. It's how you define components in Vue and TypeScript. You have the Ionic router outlet, which is very similar to the outlet that you have in Angular and React, which basically says, I've wrapped my whole application in an Ionic app component, and this is the area basically where the DOM, I'm just going to keep loading and updating new components. As I said, because this is TypeScript, you'll notice that you have the TS tag indicated here, which tells the Vue compiler that there's going to be TypeScript inside of here. And inside of Vue, for every component that is going to be rendered inside of this template up here, you have to include it down here inside of components. Now, the interesting thing that you should be aware of with the Vue and Ionic implementation is that currently, and I spoke to the developer of the Ionic team, they don't have a solution other than to throw warnings in your browser console if you haven't actually done the import of the Ionic component. So you can put this tag in the page, and if you hadn't imported the component, it will still compile because it's just a tag. I've got burned by it a couple of times, so just make sure that whatever you import here under Ionic Vue, that you have included inside of your components. All right, so this is your initial app component. It renders the app component. And then the next place that we will go is to look at how everything gets all wound up. And so let's go back to, let me just make a point of something I skipped here in the initial index.tx, which was the loading of the router. Where did it just go? Let's go back here. And so here it's telling Vue after you create the app, we're going to load Ionic Vue, but then it's loading this router object. And it's waiting for the router to be ready before it actually mounts the app in the DOM. So let's take a look at how we set up your router. So what you do is you basically create an array of these route objects. I'll just kind of briefly walk through what's happening here. This says for the default path, redirect to the login path. This is the login path, so it says when the path is login, I can also name my routes, so I named it. And this is basically lazy loading the Vue component. So when you do this component with this function import, it will lazy load the component, meaning that it won't load this component until you hit the route. So any component, so for example, when this app starts up, the first thing it does is let me log out. It just loads this login page. So all the other components that are part of the app are not getting logged in because the only route that's been hit so far is the login, and so it will load in this login page view, and that's the only component that gets loaded in.
And that's default behavior, I assume.
No, you can remove this, and you can just go like this, and then import the component, and then it will
Okay.
load the component that way.
Okay, and it'll load it regardless. But if it does it this way, it's lazy loaded.
Exactly.
Oh, okay, excellent.
Yeah. And then, now the next thing that we have here is this tabs path, which leads to some confusion often with folks. So we set the route. We say which component we want to load. So right here, it's not lazy loading. I just noticed this is not lazy loading the tabs component. I wonder if you can lazy load that. I'll have to look into that. So this is saying take the tab, when I hit this tabs route, load this tabs component. And what it's doing is there's child routes inside of the tabs path. So I have a path called tabs 1. No, sorry, this is my redirect. So if the default path that's hit is just tabs /, it will redirect to tabs /1. And tabs /1 loads the tab with the name 1. And then this is how I create the kind of child component or the detail page of the tab 1 view. Is you just create a child component on this view. And so the path here, let me go over to it here in the app. So if you see up here in the top that the path here is tabs. So the top level is tabs, then 1, and then 1 detail. And so that's how you get to the detail page. And Ionic manages the back button and all the navigation stuff for you out of the box. So you don't need to deal with managing that. It keeps track of where you are in the navigation tree. Another child component of my tabs is tab 2, which is this tab. And so that's how you create the router path. Any questions?
Well,
On
that's
these
pretty
that I don't have
straightforward.
questions.
Someone, go ahead.
I was just saying it's pretty straightforward.
Yeah. Let me see if there's anything in the chat. Come on, chat. Okay. Next, moving along. Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I do like about Vue is it's, in my opinion, it's pretty straightforward. I like the kind of separation that you don't necessarily get with React, but a lot of it I just think comes down to preference. I don't get into the religious wars over which framework you should use. I think you should just use what works for you. Okay, so we'll start from the top at the components. So if we go back to my route, let's start with the login page. So let's see, what do we have in the login page? Let's start at the top. The first thing to notice that in Vue on your page is everything's inside of this template tag. Also, like React, it needs a top level element for everything to sit inside. You can't have like another element sitting up here like this. It will complain. You cannot do that. It all needs to be nested. So for Ionic, you want to nest everything inside of an Ion page. One of the things that you'll notice that's different than React is that although you have to load the component in as Ion page like this, in the template, the standard practice is to use this hyphen notation versus the camel case that you see here and that you normally see in React. So once again, the process for any component that you use is to first import the component, then to add it to the components property for the page component, and then to use this hyphen nomenclature when you use it inside of your template. So we have our Ionic page, and then inside of our Ionic page, we have a header. For properties, the header has a translucent property. This colon here means that you're binding to this property, so it allows you to evaluate what's inside of the parentheses. So this could be something like x, y is less than 2, then set it to true, otherwise set it to false. This is complaining because, as it says, it's not being exported to the template, but I'm just doing this as an example to show you that when you use this binding here with this colon, it will interpolate what's inside of the quotes and assign that to the property translucent. Let me put that back. Then inside your header, you have a toolbar. Inside the toolbar, you have a title. And then you have your Ion content. I helped a guy the other day who got stuck. I strongly encourage you, actually, I can't think of a reason why you would not embed an Ionic, your content on a page inside of Ionic content. The Ion content manages a bunch of stuff for you, so always make sure that you embed your page's content inside of Ion content. All the classes that exist in Angular and React all come over to Vue also. Unlike React, you just use class here. You do not have to use class name. This is an example here where I'm using the Ionic loading component. So as I said before, I have added it. I've imported it, added it as a component, and then now I have access to my template. Just what I was talking about earlier, this colon here means that it's going to get the value of it is loading and assign it to is open. As opposed to if I took the binding off, it would assume that you want to assign the string is loading to this is open, which clearly is not what we want. You want to interpret the is loading property and assign its value to is open. You can see here on message, there's no colon in front because I don't want to bind it to this. I just want to take the value of string and assign it to message. As for events, the way they handle events are with the ampersand. So if you load in the proper plugins, you should get the list of events that come by default for the component that you're using. So basically what I'm saying on the click event here, execute this function do login. With Vue, if there is no parameters that need to be passed, you do not need to just put an empty set of parens like this. You can just leave it empty like that and everybody's happy. Okay. Now going down into the actual script section, as I said here, this is TypeScript. Hold on, let me get some water. We import the router with the use router. This is my hook, which I'll go over later, which I'm importing. And then we have our login page. We name our component. We import the components that we want. And this whole setup approach is new to Vue 3. For those who have used Vue before, I think you remember the old way where you had the data section and then you had the methods section. That is not they're strongly encouraging the people use this approach. I believe you can still use the old approach, but there's just a lot of benefit that you get from using the setup approach, which is mostly you can start to decompose pieces of your application into smaller sets of functions or components instead of sticking a lot of business logic just inside of one component. So the use router here gives me access to the router. The use login gets me access to my login composable, which I will go over after I get through this page. This ref here. So what this says is create a local property or variable called isLoading. I'm using TypeScript, so I'm defining the type of it as Boolean. I'm setting the default value to false. And this ref makes it reactive, i.e., when this value changes, it will force the template to re-render, which is exactly what I want. Here is my function, my do login function. When you're using refs like this is an important thing to remember. When you're inside of your script area, you have to access the actual value of the reference when you change it. But when you're in the template, like I am up here, Vue will unwrap this for you. So you don't have to say up here loading.value. Vue has unwrapped it already for you inside of the template. You just need to say is loading. But anywhere inside of your script where you're using that, you have to access the value property to update it. So what I'm saying here in my function, when you call do login, I want to set is loading to true. By setting is loading to true, it will force it to show this the is loading dialog. I am then calling my function, which I imported from my use login composable, which I will cover after this. It's asynchronous, so it will wait until it's done. I don't care about the result here, so that's why I'm not listening for it. And then I will set my loading to false. Because loading is reactive, as soon as I change this to false, it will force it to re-render this template. It will then hide my is loading dialog. And then I'm using the router that I got using this use router here, and I'm replacing the path to the next path that I want to go to, which is the tabs 1 page. So these are the functions that exist inside of the setup. And then now to get access to any of this stuff inside of my template, you need to return it from the setup function. And so I'm returning my router because I need my router in the top. I'm returning my function do login, and I'm returning is loading because these are I need the function in my template and I need this property in my template. I covered a lot there, so if anyone has any questions about that, let me look at the chat also. Please let me know. No questions? Okay. So let's look at the first of my composables, my use login composable. Okay. So for those who were on earlier, remember when I was talking about managing state? What this, what I'll call it a composable because that's the term they use. What it does is it allows me to extract functionality from outside of my component that I might want to use in multiple places in my application, retain that state, and also make that state reactive so that when I change it, anybody else that is using this composable will get the state change too. So this started out initially as just managing my authentication state. And so that's why you see I've set up my default function. Well, first, let me talk. I've defined my state up top. My state is reactive. The difference between reactive and ref is that you can't ref a complex object. So I couldn't put a ref here because this is a complex object. It contains multiple properties. If this was just like a primitive, actually that's the correct term. You use ref for primitives and reactive for objects. And then at the end, you'll see I'm going to convert it all back to refs when I pass it to the parent to make it easier to manage. And that's what this to refs does. All right. So once again, for those who aren't familiar with the TypeScript, basically what I'm saying is I'm creating this object called state. I'm making it reactive. It has all these properties, error, user, my list, and then I'm just basically defining the type. I kept it simple, so I didn't want to get too complicated with the type. So the error is of type energy. The error is of type any. The user can be either null or a string, and my list I set to any. So inside of my function, basically what you do is you define the functions that you want to export. So I'm exporting a login function, I'm exporting a logout function, and then you return them the exact same way you returned your properties and your functions inside of your Vue component. So what this says is that anyone who imports this function will have access to the login function I've created in here, the logout function I've created here, and then all the state that is associated with this function. Now, what I've done is that since I've put this state out here, the state basically it's static, for lack of a better. I mean, that's probably the easiest way to explain it. So this state remains in place anytime anyone calls this function. So what that does is that allows me to be in my login page, and when I say use login, which is basically calling that function, and then that function returns my login function. See, because I'm using TypeScript, it kind of shows me what the function is. So this is my login functions return, my used login composable is returning a login function. I can now call that login function here. It will set the reactive state once I log in, and then when I am in any other page in my application, if I call this function again with this use login, and I can add my user to it, you can see my user is available. It's and since it's a ref of type string, anytime my user object changes or is updated, I will get access to that value. And that's the same concept that I'm going to use later to show how I'm basically managing a list of data inside of my composable that whenever it updates, all the other pages that reference it will get the updates.
So it's sort of like a singleton in this context. You can call it from any page, but it's going to maintain one state object.
That is correct. And the important thing is that it's reactive. So if you're using any of these variables in your page, the page will re-render when you change this value.
Okay.
So one of the places another place you'll see something like this often, I see this question all the time too, is how do I get my user information to show up in my side menu after I log in, right? And so in one place in your application, you're logging in and you're getting your user information, you're loading that data, and then as soon as I open my side menu, I expect to see that new user information in that page, right? If you're using, to use your language, if you're using this reactive singleton, right, that menu page should always have these values in it. They should just check if they're empty, and if they're empty, don't render them. If there is a value in them, then render them. But you don't need to keep making a call to get the user data. Because it's reactive, it will just appear there once it appears. And once the person logs out and you clear that data, it will be removed from that view also. That make sense?
Yeah, that was good.
So I mean, you said that this is who's this talking? I believe that's
This is Greg.
Greg. Yeah. So you said you've done some stuff with React. It's basically like a React hook.
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, it's very familiar.
it's an extremely powerful concept, and for those who weren't on earlier, I was kind of raving about it. It's like just play with this, get very familiar with it. It will make your life a lot easier. It's a pattern that you should get very comfortable with to minimize. As I said earlier, I see a lot of people making unnecessary database calls when they already have the data in state. They just don't know an easy way to get it. That's one. And then two, they're constantly executing queries to get data that they've already had on another page, when if it was just in a reactive state, they wouldn't have to requery. It's just there. So that's what's going on here. And so what I've done with my login function to kind of fake that I'm actually doing something, I've wrapped this whole thing in a promise. I do a set timeout so I can show the loading indicator. And then if we look at the code, for those who aren't familiar with this async await, it's equivalent to a promise. So when I call do login, I set the value, it shows my loading indicator. I call my login function. My login function is just faking a login. It's taking whatever email address it gets. It's setting the value to the user. It's setting the error, and then I'm just logging it out. And then resolve is true, so it comes back. Another way that this is very helpful is that if an error actually occurred, and if I had some sort of error component in my UI, as soon as I set this value here, the UI would see that the state error has changed, and it would then render my error component on my page. I wouldn't have to check for an error. I wouldn't have to tell it to draw it. It will just automatically draw it because the state is reactive and it's been updated. So the idea is that you can get things to happen in your application by just changing the state of your application as opposing to tell your application to do something. That's how you really want to start to think about things. How can I modify state and through state changes get my application to change its behavior? That's kind of the magic that we're trying to get here. All right?
Can I interrupt you for a sec?
Yeah, go ahead.
All this reactive stuff, is that going to be part of my Vue education, or is that a separate group of topics?
Um, these are basic Vue concepts. Right now, they're pushed very heavily now. I didn't want to cover it in this, because it's a more complex topic. But in the past, the way you managed a lot of this was through using a state manager called vuex, which is the default state manager for Vue. It's kind of like the same way. I mean, you haven't really used React, Doug, but to kind of help you understand, Greg, maybe the same way how before everyone thought for every problem I had to use Redux to solve it. That's how people thought about Vue. For every problem around state, I have to use Vuex to solve it. And what composables are just showing is there's another way to manage reactive variables other than going all in with Vuex. So a couple of the scenarios that I've mentioned, Doug, like you're going to run into very quickly when you start to build any application, right? I mean, this is similar. So it's been a while since I've done Angular, but it's the same reason why you started creating services in Angular and then using behaviors and observables inside of your service, right?
Right.
It's a similar concept. In my opinion, I find RxJS extremely confusing and overly complex, but it is what it is. But it's basically the same concept. I have this state that is reactive, that in the Angular perspective, I can basically listen or observe or subscribe to changes, right? But here, you create this state object, it is reactive, and the template is smart enough to know when it changes. So you don't have to listen and say, oh, it's changed, now do something. Right?
Wow. Okay.
So that's what you got. Alrighty. So that's basically how the login and the logout works. So let's move on to another page. So we covered the login. It's just a tab page is pretty straightforward. So let's cover the tab page. A lot of this is similar to what we've done before. We've set up our page. This is something new that we haven't seen before. So the way to get my logout button up here in the corner is I create my toolbar. Inside of my toolbar, I say I have buttons because I can put multiple buttons up here on the side. There's this idea of slots, so I specified a slot as the end. If I change this to start, you'd see it moves the button over to the left side. I really want it in the end, so let's put it back to end. And then it renders the button over there in the corner. Because I say buttons, I believe I can put multiple buttons in there, and it should stack them next to each other like that. Here, when you click the button, I want to call my logout function, as I stated before. Since there's no parameters, I don't need to put the parentheses. And so that's how I get my logout. This is the same loading message. Why is there loading on my detail page? Oh. We already covered loading, but let's talk a little bit about routing here. So here on my button, on my detail page, when this button's clicked, I want it to use the router, and I want to push this new path, which is 1/1 detail, to go to my detail page. I believe this is the way that you would see it normally. I believe with this Ionic component, there's a new, I think it's called router link. So I think that I can add a router link property on here and just pass this path directly. And I haven't done it before because I like to keep things as simple as possible so that when someone reads it, they understand, oh, when I click the button, I'm going to get my router and I'm going to push a new path onto the stack. So that's what this is doing here. This is basically saying, take my user object, these two mustaches mean interpolate this value and render it on the page. And so if let's reset this page. Did I break something? Yeah. So when I log in with my fake user, this is rendering my username right here. So that's what's doing. That's what this user is doing. And then here is how you render a list. We're using our Ionic list component. This v4 is the equivalent of the ng4 or whatever React just uses a regular for loop. But it's basically saying, take my list, which is my object that I created, iterate through it, use the item when value as the key Ionic item. Inside my item, I have a label, and then I just render the contents. Let me put something in there so we actually have some data showing up. Let's move this chat. If I go to my tab 2, tab 1, tab 2, I think I'm kicking an error somewhere because, there you go. When I've added the object, I switch back to my other page, I see the objects here. And so that's drawing the item, and then the item when is the time, and it's drawing in the second level. As I go back and I add new objects, in, and you can see there's no code inside of here that says get my list again. It's just knows that the list changed because the list changed and it's reactive, that it needs to redraw this, and so it just redraws it with the new items in it. All these imports are the same. Going through that. So here you can see how I'm using my use login function again, but this time I'm extracting more properties and functions out of it. I'm getting my list that I want to render, I have my logout function, and then I have the name of the actual user that's logged in. And I need all of these properties in my template. So I import them or create them. Then you can see at the end, you kind of return them from your function, and that's how you get access to them in your template. This login is laid out this logout's laid out the exact same way as the login. I'm setting my loading value, I'm calling my logout, and then I'm replacing the route to get back to login. Let's quickly look at tab 2 because we're getting close to end of time and I want to make sure I show capacitor. When we look at tab 2, what tab 2 was doing, because I wanted to demonstrate how the input works. So I'm binding. So I have my input fields. Let's go back to tab 2. I have my input field that I want to update, or I want to capture value in. So I'm using this v model, which basically will bind whatever I type inside of this input field to this item object. Item is down here. It's a ref because it's a simple object. It's just a string, so it's just a ref. If you notice, I'm not unwrapping it because I'm in a template, so I can just say vModel item. So anything I type in this field will automatically be assigned to the object item. I explained to you the function. This is the add function, and then this list is just kind of drawing the raw text here in the bottom. We go down to my add item function. My add item function says give me my list, which I got from my function. Remember, I'm inside my template, so I have to use the value to get the actual value of my list. It's just an array, so then I just push the object on top of my array, and then I clear the item value so that the input form gets cleared out after I add the item. And then, sound like a broken record, but once again, we're returning anything that I've either imported or created that I need access to in my template at the end of my setup here. So I need my add item function. I need my item object because that's what I'm getting the input from. And then my list is, I need my list because, do I need my list? I actually don't need to export my list. Well, let's delete that. because I'm not using it anywhere inside of my temp. Actually, that's a lie. I'm drawing it right there. I think it complained. So I do need my list. So that goes back. So that's the basic gist of the application, and I'm kind of speeding up at the end here because I want to show the capacitor part of it. Any questions on that? Is there anything that I didn't show that you were wondering about with the Ionic View integration?
Like it kind of reminds me of a hybrid between Angular and React. There's the best parts of Angular, the best parts of React, and here you got Vue.
That's what someone said. That's what Vue is. What would happen if Angular and React had a child?
Okay, it's exactly what it looks like.
Yeah, because there's a lot of similarities between the two different frameworks. Also, the way that I look at it is I think Vue was the last one, so it had the opportunity to kind of learn from the two other frameworks, and like you said, kind of find the parts of each one that was good and kind of put them together to create Vue. And so I think that's kind of what we have here. So, as I said, all this source code is zipped up and available inside the chat. Let's hop over to Capacitor. So let me do this. Get that out of the way. Make sure I put this in the chat. I'll also send the chat out to everyone at the end because Zoom keeps it a running list of it. So anything I put in there, you get. And then the other part I want to make sure I touch on is the live reload, which is pretty cool. So I'll put that in there. And then I will kind of show you the app. Okay, so let's talk about Capacitor. So Capacitor is Ionic's way of packaging up your web application. And for those who don't know, it does not have to be an Ionic application. There's demos of people taking plain Vue.js, plain React applications, adding Capacitor to them, and running them on a mobile device. You don't have to use Ionic framework components to run to deploy your application in Capacitor. They just think that it's nice to use the Ionic components because it addresses a bunch of the issues that you might run into to get your application to actually look like a mobile application when it's running on device. So let me go back here. So I'm not going to go through the setup for capacitors because it's in that documentation that I provided. But I'll point to your project and tell you what changes. So when you add capacitor to your project, one of the things that you're going to notice is that you get this capacitor configuration file added. And this keeps a bunch of information about your project. The important thing that it keeps track of is what directory your fully compiled project gets deployed to. So in Vue, it ends up going inside your dist directory. So what you have here inside of your dist directory is the version of your application that if you were, is that the directory? Yeah, here we go. This is the version of your application all bundled up as if you were going to deploy it in a hosting environment. That's what all this junk is. And what Capacitor does is it takes this bundled up version of your web application, packages it with a bunch of libraries, and deploys it on your mobile device. The very cool thing about it is that it allows you through the set of commands, Ionic cap, see if it gives me all the commands. It gives you a set of commands to help manage it. The ones you'll do most often is you'll use the add a native platform to your project, and then to kind of run your project. And the sync is used often when you have a bunch of plugins, native plugins that need to be utilized. The sync can move the native code back and forth between your application and your development environment. People complain that I do too much stuff in iOS, so I tried to be a little crazy. So the same process as before, instead of in at iOS, I think I already added iOS, so yeah. iOS already exists, so let's just kind of do the next part, which is the command to run it is to say Ionic cap run iOS. So you can see down here, it's building the app for production. So it's basically bundling up your Vue website. So it's got the whole thing bundled up, and then it kicked open my Xcode, and then now inside of my Xcode, I can run the project. And here, so here's my simulator. It looks like I had this running with a live reload before. So if you notice, when it started up, it popped up that little dialog saying it's loading the app from localhost. So what that means is that that's strange. So what that means is it is running my app from this local website. So I should be able to make changes to my application and see them automatically appear on my device. So let's go back to where's my login page? That's the page that's open. There's also a video that walks through all of this on my YouTube channel, which I will include at the end of this link. At the end of this video, and I'll also paste it in the chat. So if I go to Vue's login page, see if I can get this final part of the demo working properly. Go up here and say, so as you can see, the change that I made immediately appeared on my device. Now with live reload, this device could actually be a real device. I could have, when I work at home, I have my Xcode connected to my iPhone over the network. So I can set up my development environment using Ionic and Live Reload so that as I make changes, I don't know if you notice it, but so if I change this again, if you watch down here, you'll see that Ionic is detecting the change in the application. It's recompiling the source code. And since this app is looking at this URL for the web content that it's loading, it automatically updates the device. So it allows you, when you're working on just the UI functionality, to very quickly iterate through changes in your UI, actually on device, without going back and forth between a full cycle of builds. What did I change when that is not working? Is loading. Is loading is false. It's loading. I don't know why that's not going away. I'll figure this out and post and fix the issue. This all was working properly before. So that's the gist of all the things that I wanted to cover today. I kind of went a little fast at the end to make sure I got it all. So if anyone has any questions, feel free to ask. Yeah, there it goes. Just needed to get reloaded. And that's a wrap. Let's see if there's anything in the chat. All right, y'all. Well, I will give you back 4 minutes of your life. Take a look at what I've done, and let me know if there's any additional questions you have. I'm going to make that last change to see what's going on with that code, and then I will, since I have both you guys' contact information, I will send you the updated source. I will send you also kind of this chat thread in case you want any of the links inside of it. And then I will post this video to YouTube, and I will shoot you an email when it's posted.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Aaron.
Enjoy
All
the
right,
rest of your
bye-bye.
evening.
You
You too.
too. Many
All right,
thanks.
bye now.